Great. So please welcome our two authors for tonight, LaCorte and Kelsey Dimberg. Welcome, ladies. Because I try to do this carefully with the books, like place cards. That's nice one. Great. Here we go. So what's really special about tonight, aside from all of you coming, for which we are very excited, is we have two debut novels, and both of them set in Arizona, or at least part of yours, virtually all of yours, but you have to use the microphone. So it's really exciting because Arizona, I've always thought that we are somewhat underserved in the crime community. For some reason, people flock to Boston or, Minneapolis, the Twin Cities has a disproportionate number of writers and so forth. Chicago, my hometown, actually doesn't. There's Sarah Paretsky and Michael Harvey, and in crime, that's more or less a.
You want to? Sure, I guess I was thinking of Sarah. Is this on?
Yeah. Should be.
Okay.
There you are. Well, Sarah's a big presence and therefore disproportionate, but in fact, she's only one person. So we're trying to build up a crime community here in Phoenix of local authors, but it's actually a great hunting ground. C.J. Box's last thriller last March, we loved it. He sent it to me and he said, "You're going to really like this book." And it turned out that Scottsdale was the killing field. The assassin stayed at the Hotel Valley Ho, and the bait for the victim was the Poison Pen Bookstore. I mean, CJ and I are really old friends, so we did it on purpose, but still, it was fun. Anyway, who should we start with? You want to volunteer? Either one of you?
Sure.
Okay. So this is Ellen, and she's going to talk to us about her book, The Perfect Fraud, which has links to Sedona.
It does. Thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to see a lot of friends in the audience, people I haven't seen for years. So thanks for holding this get together for me. So that was great.
Drinks are later.
You heard her. Drinks are later. I think you could solve the crime mystery problem to have more crime in Arizona.
We have a staff member who bakes, and on Saturday afternoons we have free food, so we always have a good crowd. But we don't have a liquor license, so we don't have to adjourn to the Hotel Valley Ho Bar.
Well, I'm all for that. The book is The Perfect Fraud by Harper, and I'm thrilled to represent it here today. I'll just tell you a quick story about the inception of the idea. My husband, as many of you know, is a very solid, down-to-earth, normal kind of guy. And we met in college eons ago, and he has other interests, and those include aliens and spaceships and the Ouija board and psychics. So he introduced me to psychics, and we've been going off and on for years, and more recently a lot since I was doing research on the book. And during that part of the research, we went to a town in Pennsylvania, and we both went to separate psychics at the same time. And afterwards, we met on the bench, and I said, "Well, how was it?" He said, "Oh my God, it was excellent. The psychic says the family is wonderful, business is great, our kids are doing well." He said, "How was yours?" And I started to sob. And he said, "Well, what happened?" And I said, "Well, the psychic had given me a reading that was somewhat on the mark and a lot off the mark. But at the end, she said, I can tell by your cards and by the reading that you're not giving enough to your marriage." She said, "But don't worry. For $450, I can be your soul sister. And I can not only get you to contribute to your marriage, but also to get you to a higher plane." So fortunately, I took a breath and laughed, and Mike assured me I was getting plenty to marriage. But I thought, what better idea, what better way for somebody to get to a woman especially than telling her she's not giving enough? And what better way to get to her wallet? So that gave me the idea of one of the characters in the book, whose name is Claire. Claire Hathaway is a psychic who lives now in Sedona. She moved there mostly to get away from her mother. Her mother is a world-renowned psychic who is the real deal. Claire was raised in the psychic arts, but fully believes she's lost any skills, that she doesn't have it anymore. So she does what she thinks she can do, which is sort of giving clients what she thinks they want to hear. So she's been faking it. She has a boyfriend, Cal, but she's resistant to make any kind of commitment. As she was growing up, her mother gave her most of the responsibility for caring for a very ill father, and Claire is up to here with responsibility. She just can't take on anymore. until she meets Rena. Rena Cole is a mother in New Jersey with a very sick daughter. Her daughter is only 4. She's been sick since she was born with a terrible, terrible stomach issue. And Rena devotes her whole life to finding out what is the problem with Stephanie. And she mommy blogs all the time, and it gets a lot of advice from other moms about what she should try, what she should do, but nothing seems to work. So she decides she's going to do research and looks for the best pediatric gastroenterologist who happens to be in Arizona. So you can probably hear what's coming. The 2 women happen to meet up on a plane because of a seat change. Now, one of the themes of the book is that, in my mind, things happen for a reason. So why are these 2 women put together on a plane together? And that's when their lives start to collide, and they have to figure out who they really are. But it's Stephanie, the little girl, whose life hangs in the balance.
So now you know why this book takes place partially in Sedona, which is the really upscale part as compared to Quartzsite. Some of you have been to Quartzsite, which is the very downscale, psychic part of Arizona, right? Driving west to Los Angeles. So they do it naked, some of them too. So it's even more exciting, right? No,
That's going to be in the next book for sure.
I just mentioned it if you wanted to know, the darker side. You could go to Quartzsite. No, I mean, Sedona has got lots of, crystals and alternate lifestyles. It's sort of like it's on an axis with Santa Fe, where there's a considerable amount of. Actually, the new word is wellness.
Yes.
If any of you have been paying attention, you don't go to a spa anymore, and it's not like dieting or. I don't know if any of you remember, but what was the Phoenician once upon a time was Eve Arden's guest ranch or whatever, where it's where women came to dry out or drop off pounds. And the legend was, because it was in a citrus grove, that the trees were stripped totally bare, not only of fruit but leaves, by the starving women. So we've come a long way, and leaf eating is probably not part of wellness, right? But there now is a whole thing all over the world about, taking care of yourself, and so there's the site, people looking for insights and so forth is not uncommon. But the other thing is that's really true in your book is that Phoenix has become, thanks to Mayo and Biogen and ASU and the whole bit, a huge, medical complex and biosciences and the whole bit. So it's not surprising that the wouldn't be the Barrow, for example. The Barrow Institute at St. Joseph is one of the great neurological centers. That's where they have neurosurgeons. So I'm trying to get more books in Phoenix. Talking about right. So Kelsey, you are gone in a different direction.
Yes,
And we're going to knock out the idea that this was really Senator McCain's family that you're writing about at the very beginning, right?
I just learned from an Uber driver the other day that McCain started out in real estate, and I was like, oh no. That's
If you
not a
watch
coincidence.
long enough, because you're facing it, he will come up, because we have done book events with him, and there was a photo just as you sat down of John signing books flashing up on the television.
Yes, so he seemed like a very
He's
lovely
keeping
person,
an eye on you.
and he's a separate entity from my senator. So my book is centered on a wealthy political family in Arizona, and the patriarch is the senator, a long-standing U.S. senator, and his son Philip is a former college football player and current real estate developer and restaurateur. And he's a little bit of a ne'er-do-well, I would say. His father and wife really wanted to follow in the family footsteps and sort of take up this mantle, and he's not 100% sold. His wife, Marina, is the director of a fictional Native American arts museum, and the whole story is narrated from their nanny's point of view. And she is from the Midwest, sort of starting over after sort of a heavy past of her own, and she meets Philip by chance and gets invited to babysit and then becomes the nanny, and she loves the Martins. She's totally dazzled by their world and thinks they're just a wonderful family and really attaches to them. And when the book begins, she inadvertently learns some dirt on the family that if it came to light, it would be really damaging. The senator is running for re-election, and this information could really make the family look bad. So her instinct is to sort of protect the family and try to hide it, and sort of blows up in her face.
So this is crime fiction, so we already know from the day the first page, that the family can't be the paragons that they appear to be, right? Otherwise there'd be no plot at all
Exactly.
in the book.
Yeah.
But the thing that links your two books together are the two little girls. Because
Yes.
you have a little girl called Amabel, and everything seems to be great with Amabel,
Yep. She's
and then
a
it isn't.
wonderful, precocious little 4-year-old girl, a bit of a fibber. So when the story begins, Finn, the nanny, and Amabel are at a fair, and Amabel says, "That woman is following me," and she points to this real young, beautiful, red-haired girl who's just minding her own business, and Finn thinks, whatever, you just, I think she's obsessed with Ariel from The Little Mermaid at the time, and it's, okay, she's sort of fibbing, trying to get attention, because their parents are so wrapped up in this political race. And of course, it turns out that she's not fibbing, and this woman really is following her around, and sort of why. That's the piece of string that sort of leads into the mystery.
There have been a lot of books written in actual journalism, because it's really happened, about the hazards of having nannies or au pair girls. I'm sure you've read about some of the pluses, but there have also been some very serious crimes. One in New York City, I think, not too long ago.
Yeah, there was a French crime fiction about that, The Perfect Nanny.
Yeah, that's the nanny book. But I'm talking about in real life. There,
Yeah,
was
she based it on that Brooklyn family.
right.
Yeah.
So when we already know that the family can't be that perfect, and then we have to think maybe the nanny isn't going to, or we don't know.
Exactly.
So we're already suspicious, right? We're on page 5, going along.
Yeah, it's that tense situation because, the nanny's not part of the family and is probably of a completely different social and economic class than the family that she works for. Yet she's in their house all day, has access to all their stuff, probably has access to tons of personal information and all their habits and behaviors. So, there's definitely that risk in letting somebody that deep in to care for your children.
In classic British crime fiction, there were always servants, like not just nannies, but you've all watched Downton Abbey, right? So you know about that. So one of the rules of British crime fiction is that butler didn't do it because it would be so easy, to always have like the servant, whatever it is, be the bad guy. By the way, I just went up to see the movie Pavarotti. Do you all know there's a Downton Abbey movie?
Yeah.
I didn't know that, and they did the preview, and I thought, how we've all aged since 1927, right? But anyway, just have to be on my mind while I was thinking about it. Anyway, your lady can't afford a nanny,
No.
so she's wrestling with a very ill child all by herself, whereas your family can't afford a nanny, but they have a well child.
Yeah.
So, there's some inequities right there.
Yeah, Rena's well educated. She's a nurse. She knows her stuff. But she is on her own. She and her husband are divorced and have a wobbly kind of relationship. Some of which is Rena's making.
Has he remarried?
He has not remarried. No, but he happens to travel a lot. He's travels for a long time out on the road, so he's not around a lot, which means Rena is the primary caretaker for this little girl.
Okay. But he does have some money, so she can be a primary caretaker.
Yeah,
without...
she's getting some money from him. She ends up working in a drugstore in Arizona, mostly because she needs a little bit of money, but she's also, as any of you know who maybe have cared for young children who are chronically ill or for parents who are ill, she's gone a little nuts being at home. So she works in this drugstore where she meets up with Lewis. And it's hard to tell whether Lewis is sort of the guy who's going to save her life. So she's taken by him right away.
We probably can't say anything more.
No, we can't.
No. We may have already gone too far.
I'm like
right, okay.
walking around the plot.
We are walking around the plot, right. So another question we can dispense with is that this wonderful Native American museum is not actually the Heard Museum.
No, it is Marina's pet project. So it's a little bit of a vanity project for her. She's passionate about art, but she uses it for a lot of fundraisers and these sort of hoity-toity social events where all the wealthy Phoenicians sort of flock.
So is this a city-funded
network.
museum, or is this her own?
I pictured it as a private museum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which I think it almost would have to be for her to play the role that she does.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of her time goes. While everybody else is running for office, she's actually running the museum, right?
She's there, and she's networking and running the museum.
So tell us about your background. How many of you read the piece in the paper? A lot of you. So this won't come as a huge surprise. But you spent time here at ASU, right?
Yes. So when I was real young, my family moved around a lot. My dad was a hotel manager, and he and my mom had always lived in Wisconsin their whole lives. So they thought, this will be an adventure. We'll just move all over the place. So I was born in Seattle, and then we lived in Houston, Salt Lake City, Denver, and then Phoenix for a few years here. And then eventually they settled back in Wisconsin, almost inevitably, where they came from. But I really loved it here when I was real young, and then when I graduated from high school, I moved here to go to ASU, to the Barrett Honors College there, which was wonderful. And I started out resisting being a writer. I thought I should be very, very practical. So I was actually studying business and Chinese, like as if I was going to be this international businesswoman, which I could not be worse at that.
You were doing the right language, looking at how things are going.
Yeah, and I stuck with it. Maybe I would be.
You're not fluent in Japanese at this point?
I'm
sorry,
not.
Chinese?
No, I'm not, no. So within about 2 years, I ended up just sort of disliking it and switching over to English literature. And then when I graduated, it was 2008, and it was not a great time to graduate with an English literature degree.
It's never a great time. In terms of job hunting, it's actually great to graduate with an English literature degree, but it's not vocationally oriented.
Fair enough. Yeah. So then I went to go and get my MFA in San Francisco, and that's where I
That's
started.
the other thing that English majors do is they go to graduate school.
Yes, exactly. I'm like, let's sink a little more money into this project. What could go wrong? And then I moved there, and San Francisco is like the opposite of Phoenix. It's it's freezing, it's foggy, it's hilly, it's right on the ocean. And I started writing a very, very literary novel. It was like a coming-of-age novel, which I now think of as my sad guy novel, because this character was just so full of angst. His brother married his I don't know. It was a very, angsty story, and I had to write it for my thesis, so I finished it and turned it in, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna take a break. And I was watching a lot of classic noir, so like Double Indemnity and The Maltese Falcon.
Books that had actual plots.
Chinatown. Yes, exactly. And I was like, oh, this is how you make it not really boring. So, at least for me, I really struggled within that sort of literary fiction framework. And once I started writing like a crime fiction framework, then all of a sudden I felt like it came alive, and the story just grabbed me. And I've been working on it for many years.
The great thing about crime fiction is it actually has, like romance, it has a bit of a roadmap to plot.
Yeah.
There are certain, things. And do I remember, or did I hear that you had written romance before you? Or am I making that up?
You're making that.
I am making that up.
What should I do?
Have you too found that crime fiction presents you with a plot? Or at least a structure to, because you do need one.
I'm a full believer in that at least the books that I've tried to write have had subplots to them, so
Okay.
that so the readers will keep an interest. So in this one, there is a romance. There are mother-daughter issues. There's certainly health issues
Right.
involved, and then the whole otherworldly plot with psychics.
Did you force yourself to spend time in Sedona?
Force myself.
I was being sarcastic, sorry. It's a
Yeah,
lovely
what a
place
tough,
to spend
tough-
time.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. We're from East Coast originally, but moved here, and there are people in the audience who still haven't forgiven me for that. But we moved back to New Jersey in 1998 and have been there for 20 years. But we lived here for 25 years, so we spent a lot of time. Normally, it was exactly when it was 115 and our air conditioning would break. and we go to Sedona, which is just gorgeous. No complaints whatsoever.
Okay. Where did I hear the romance thing? Must have made that up. Maybe I was.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, actually, I already said you were a debut novelist. Maybe I thought you were a debut crime novelist. That might be it. Otherwise, this was a ridiculous conversation. I don't know how I got up there. I was distracted by the TV, right? I should really turn that off when we're doing this. Right. So, anything, let's talk about if you're going to have a new book, because hardly ever does a publisher do a one-book contract anymore. So generally, they want you to write a second book.
I am working on one, and actually, you nicely referenced it earlier when you were talking about wellness. I find that modern wellness to be fascinating. I followed Goop, which is Gwyneth Paltrow's sort of baby, and it is so bizarre, and it is just these
Unbelievably expensive.
Yes, expensive, and these suggestions are so out there, and you know, and I think that it really comes from, like Ellen was saying, when you tell women like something's not quite right, and here's how to fix it, you know. So I thought that that was really fascinating, and then I was also really interested in the book Bad Blood, about Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos scandal. So I'm kind of exploring those two different interesting subjects for me, and my next book should focus on.
But it won't be the same characters that are
No,
in the story.
it's all new. Yeah,
Right.
all new characters.
And how about you?
Yeah, we're talking about a new book, and I have ideas for it. Originally, Harper had asked me if we wanted to serialize something with this psychic, but I'm not feeling it. But I do feel that the psychic will show up in another book, which I already have sort of an outline in my head for.
I was going to ask you that. I feel like there's a little hint at the
Yeah,
end.
I know.
That maybe she...
How many people have read it, The Perfect Frog?
Great. Any of you in the audience, since many of you seem to know the authors, have questions that you would like to ask? Here's your moment. No? Come on. Otherwise, I have to think of other stupid wrench to make. Yeah.
I'll ask one. When you're writing books, do you start out knowing the whole plot and where you're going, or does it kind of evolve as you move along?
So, can I restate that because the camera can't hear it? When you start out writing, do you know where your plot's going, or does it evolve as you move along? I think it was for both of you.
Okay,
essentially.
I knew where the plot was going. I knew what I wanted to have happen, but I've been saying that oftentimes the characters will tell me how they're going to get there. So I have certain plot points in mind, and then I'll say, well, what would Claire do in this situation? You really intimately have to get to know your characters in order to make it real. So, but I'm not a plotter. I don't outline. I don't have multiple, cards around reminding me of things. I've been saying that I do a lot of writing in the shower. So when I sit down to write, it's not. I'm not saying this to brag, but I don't have writer's block because I don't sit down to write unless I have something to write. So I kind of know what the next chapter is going to be, and the characters will inform me what they're going to do to help me get to the next chapters.
I'll finish, yeah. So my very first couple of drafts, I didn't really know. I had the seed of this, of the little girl telling her nanny someone's following her, and I had a rough idea of what the family's secret was. And so I wrote the whole thing more or less blind, and then I got to some somewhat disturbing things, and I was like, oh, that's where this is going. And then I went back, and then it was just more about discovering the characters and why they would do these things and who they were and filling in. So I'd say my first few drafts are a little bit more blind and just sort of freewheeling, and then go back in and impose a little bit more order and logic to it.
Most of writing is rewriting, as you will gather from listening to that. Did you have a question, ma'am?
My question is, with all of the publicity about John McCain and his family that's just gone on and on and on, do you feel your book is stepped away from that, and that your characters are really different, and it is a different, completely scenario?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think I was a little bit dense when I was writing it, to the point where I realized years in, like, oh, they even have the same initials. Well, that's not ideal. But I was like, well, that's his name. I'm sorry, John McCain, I can't change it. And yeah, so they're so separate in my mind that I felt like it would be okay.
So
And
I can read it and think that it's
Yeah,
completely different.
I think once you meet the
I've read
senator,
it. It's not the McCains.
Yeah.
In fact, if you really think about the older senator, he's a lot more like Carl Hayden than he is John McCain, I think. Don't you? I mean,
Yeah,
he was
I don't think
he
he
was the
would.
real dynast. You know, McCain's always been a maverick, and in this book, it's much more the Hayden tradition.
Yeah, Mary Bob is Martin family name. Almost East Coast a little bit in that. Like, gotta carry on this name, gotta, like, you know.
Yeah, but it's
our
true that
legacy.
Arizona's had two remarkably long-serving
Right.
senators.
It
Not
is
every
true,
state,
yeah.
you know, has got that. But Hayden was what 50 years or something, wasn't it? Some extraordinary time. And McCain, how many years did John serve in the Senate? It was a very long time. Can't remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But no, this really isn't.
Yeah.
If that was your concern. Right. Anybody else? Another question?
Ellen, I'm somewhat familiar with your background in
Are you
human
now?
resources.
Yes. Okay.
So did you just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to write a novel? I mean, a book. I mean, how did you get there?
Yeah, this is Penny. Penny and I work together at Maricopa Community College District.
One of my favorite bosses of all time.
Oh, okay. Not the right venue for that. But
And I'll just throw
did
in
you
the
like
big
the
points.
book, Penny?
I loved the book.
She's still
I'm
sucking
just-
up to you all this time. That's really scary.
That raise is coming, Penny. My background is my bachelor's is also in English, and I also graduated thinking I don't know what I'm going to do with this. It's an English education. My master's is in literature, but during that time, I started working in human resources because I really believed in the product. So you can work in human resources anywhere, but to sell education was something that I really believed in. And I had a 30-year career, including a doctorate in higher and adult education, and had wonderful, wonderful places I worked. Most recently at Villanova University in the East as their Associate Vice President for Human Resources. But during the last, I guess, 10 years I was working, I got very involved in my extracurricular activities, which included acting and singing lessons, and including painting, ballet, and also singing and dancing in community theater. And it struck me as I was increasingly involved how much I loved doing that, how much the arts were really fulfilling to me. So Mike and I talked it over for about 3 years and decided to make the move. And I would love to tell you that I had this idea for a book all those years and I couldn't wait to get it. It's just not, it's not true. I always had stories, and we would take road trips with the Shaddocks who have kids just about our age, and the kids would get bored in the car. So I was always telling stories, and they always had hints in them, like you had to answer a question before you could go through this door. So I knew I had stories in me, and I always had ripped out articles that I thought would be interesting. But you're raising a family, you've got a degree, you got work, you're making money, and I just thought it was impractical. So I did the silliest, most absurd thing in the world, and I quit my job. And while I was, Villanova had a search that didn't go through, and they asked me to stay on, and I said I would stay on for 6 months, but on a part-time basis, so I could start to write. And then I started to write, and I wrote, maybe this is where you got, I don't know, unless you're looking in my notes, but I wrote 2 other books before this one. The first one, I was sent it out. I was so stupid. I mean, I knew nothing about writing. I knew nothing about the business at all. So I sent it out to agents, and I got this call from this New York agent, and she said, you're a writer. Why have you been doing this? This is great. And I thought, well, who says this is so hard? So he's like, hey. And she said, but don't go out with this book. She said, it's not ready. Don't go with it. So it's like the first pancake or the first child. It just wasn't baked right. It wasn't good. So I wrote a second book, and that did get an agent, but it didn't sell, which happens. It's sort of the ugly underside. It didn't sell. I wrote this book, and this was a whole different animal. So it sort of evolved, and I just had to learn as I went. And there's a lot to be said for doing something else and being stupid and learning it. And I've never looked back and regretted it.
You didn't get this idea, which we can't discuss, from your HR career, did you?
No, but I have a lot of great
I'm
stories.
really happy you didn't.
There's no better fodder for writing about people than working in human resources.
Just remember this conversation.
Yeah, right.
And then you'll know why I asked this question, which I can't talk about at the moment. Right, I saw a hand over here somewhere.
That was my question, is how you started in this, from HR to business. But now she answered it, or she answered it for me.
There you go. I'm psychic. I just
The great thing for writers is that all life is experience. It's all material. It
Yeah,
really is.
exactly.
You know, whatever you do, you can then draw upon. And if you know the works of Ian Rankin, for example, wonderful crime writer, #1 bestseller in the UK, one of the most successful authors in the world. If you look back at his biography, it includes, among other things, he was a swineherd in France. I'm serious. You know, so that's why it's very hard for very young people to write really great books, because they don't have enough life experience, and so it tends to be research driven or, you know, whatever, but not, the emotional impact would be harder to come by if you haven't actually lived through some of it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm actually jealous of your different career, because after I got my master's degree, then I got a bunch of writing jobs. So when I was writing my book, it was like I go to work and write. I wrote coupons for Groupon, and then come home.
Perfect preparation
Yeah.
for fiction.
Yeah, writing about, you know, half-price hamburgers and like waxing, and then I come home and I would write more, and it was very like, oh, you know,
Do
more.
you know that advertising, though, has actually been an incubator for a great many successful writers? Dorothy Sayers, when she wrote Murder Must Advertise, she had been in advertising. Clive Cussler started in advertising. Do you know what his very favorite, the commercial he wrote that is still my very favorite? Many of you will remember this because you're of an age to do that. Ajax, the foaming cleanser. Foam the dirt right down the drain. The genesis of Dirt Pit. Seriously, writing copy, for advertising is
Well, and learning how to write on a deadline and how to write creatively on a deadline. Yeah.
I think there's advantages to being in business and making a transition, but I will say that writing creatively, turning from writing and for business where everything is succinct and it's email driven, it took me a very long time to make that transition. And I've given workshops I belong to a great writers group in Philadelphia, and talking about how, if you can only write on a Saturday afternoon, how do you make that transition? So there's activities you can do to make the transition from a business mindset to a creative mindset, but it's not easy. I don't know how people who work full time can generate creatively. People do.
You know what? Everybody's brain is different.
Yeah, exactly.
Really, there is no right answer. Whenever we do these, which is like 4 or 5 nights a week, somebody always asks about how do you write, or and sometimes they want to know, do you write on a computer or do you write by hand or something, because they think it's a way of trying to access the creative process by the reader. But that information doesn't really help you if you want to write, because your mind may not work that way.
Right, exactly. I actually like hearing those tips because I'm convinced everyone else out there is doing it more smartly and more efficiently than me. So I'm like, what are they doing? But no, I have to do it. I have to do it my own way.
So if you all really want to watch something different, a week ago Monday, we did an event with Barbara Shapiro, B.A. Shapiro, who wrote a bestseller in The Art Forger. And then she wrote, I'm trying to remember the name of the second book, and her newest one's called The Collector's Apprentice. Really interesting woman, and in the course of the conversation, somebody asked her one of these questions. She revealed that she's a statistician by training, and that when she writes her book, she applies statistical theory and tension points so that her plots are graphed out, and other writers just like make it up as they go. So I thought it was a fabulous illustration of a different. I'd never actually heard anybody talk about tension points before, and how you could graph them across. I know that you can do that, especially if you're writing a thriller, so that the action progresses in a accelerating way, and and you don't have long pauses in a thriller. You can't afford to have like a big setback where the action all drops and everybody's going, what now? But I never heard anybody apply. You can watch it on our Facebook Live. It's a really fascinating. You might be interested in it.
Yeah.
And
I'm
as far as I know, completely original approach.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like it, yeah.
Well, they do that in sitcoms. I mean, there's a measurement of how often you're supposed to have a laugh.
That's right.
So
Okay.
I guess it could be broken down into those factors.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit about the editing process from when you send in the first draft, and how does that work? The back and forth and
Once you secure an agent,
yeah.
I can talk personally. The agent I went with is Molly Friedrich out of New York City, and she's amazing. And
Sorry, we're having a moment. What is it? Somebody's microphone is dead? Mine.
yours.
Great. Thank you for rescuing me. This is young Patrick who keeps us all honest. Thank you very much. Right, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. So what happens is the agent will generally call you when they're wanting to secure you as a client, and they'll say, "I have some ideas though," and they want to know how agreeable you are to making those changes. And there are some authors who say, "I'm not changing a single word." So you have to be careful. You don't want the story to be so altered that it turns out to be not what you wrote. And as it turned out, Molly we had a discussion. She had some great ideas. So we went back and forth with the edits. Fortunately, there weren't too many of them. Made those changes. Then when she goes out to sale, she'll send Molly in this case calls everybody, the contacts she has at the houses and the publishers in New York City, and then follows it up with a written a letter and then the manuscript. And then when Harper was interested, they asked to speak to me first. And Sarah Nelson is my editor at Harper, and she said, "Well, I love it. I was wondering about whether you would consider this or consider that." Very amenable, and her ideas were good. And it was a lot of back and forth. We met for lunch, and she had some ideas about a character, and I said, "I don't think that's going to work, but let me think about that." And I proposed something else. And I'm not sure what Kelsey's experience it is, but I can't complain at all. I hear horror stories about a book that turns out to be completely different than what you submitted. And this book has been true to my heart, and every suggestion they made I thought has been edifying and only made it better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar process for me too. My agent and I actually did a lot of editing. We did almost over a year of revising, though I was working full time, before sending it out. But yeah, I had the same thing, like a lot of suggested changes, a lot of notes, and then you have to sort of decide, like, is this something? I think you can almost immediately, like for me it was like an instinctive, like, oh yes, you're totally right. And then some of them were more like, they're just not. I had one editor, so then after I revised with my agent, he sent it out just like you described, and then I had a few editors that I spoke with on the phone, and one of them suggested an evil twin subplot, and I was like, I'll think about that. Interesting.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, and so I think sort of knowing what, like a lot of the edits are wonderful. It's a gift to have another set of eyes that hasn't been staring at these pages, and sort of your imagination gets a little bit rusty, and then someone else comes in and points out what can be changed.
So this is the danger of self-publishing, is that every author is oblivious to those things that he or she hasn't either fully explained. The book that the author writes is not entirely the book in the author's head. There's just stuff that gets in the way. I've edited almost 1,000 books by now, because we have a publishing company, which is now part of Penguin Random House. We do. And I find most often that the conversation I have is, what is going on here? And then the author will tell me, and I say, well, that's in your head, but you forgot to write it down.
Yeah.
So it's not on the page. So the real value of an editor, most of the time, is to be a first reader and say, this isn't clear, this is repetitive, I don't know what you were doing here. And then every writer has a tick. And it may be like you fall in love with an unusual word and say it's just like sprinkled throughout your book like confetti.
Yeah.
Or, because when you're writing, you're not writing in a continuous stream. We read a book, in hopefully a linear fashion, except for those who read the ending first and go back to it. But, and so things stay in your mind. But when you're writing, you know, you pick it up and you put it down, you pick it up again. To get started again, very often you wind up repeating yourself because you're trying to get back into the story. And a good editor will say, you already said that.
You missed something.
No, not you missed something. More often it's you've already said that.
You've said it's repetitive.
Right.
I would strongly advise for any of you who are thinking about writing to get a writer's group or to get beta readers to read it. I didn't do that with my first book or my second book. Part of it was fear. You know, it's that exposure. There's nothing like putting a book out and being so all of you should feel sorry and buy the book. Because, as Barbara said, it's the only way we're going to get to be New York Times bestseller. And it is for sale here.
If we want to retire in Sedona.
Or actually, if you just want the authors to come back, because if they don't sell books, the publisher will not send them here. They will send them to some other more lucrative market because it costs them a fortune. For those of you who don't know how it works, the bookstore does not pay for the author to come. The publisher does. And so they select a certain number of bookstores where they think that it will be valuable. You might be interested to know, and I'm delighted to see all of you, that 70% of our customers don't live in Arizona, and this is the very smallest part of the bookstores, the rest of the building. So we're basically the Amazon of independent bookstores, and that these books go out of here, 20% of them go overseas. So that's why we get all these terrific bestsellers here, as well as debut authors. And I hope we'll add you to the number of people who then show up for other events, because they're really a lot of fun. It's a nice night out, right? And we made a conscious decision not to talk about politics. We are not discussing politics. We are neutral. So I think people should come and have a good time and not feel like they're about to be assaulted during the evening. Right? Did you have a question?
Yeah. So reading is so subjective depending on who's reading it. So a lot of times, so I do reviews, and a big topic of that is like when somebody doesn't like a book, how it affects the author. I think sometimes people forget like authors are people who have feelings. So do you avoid reading your reviews on your book, or do you just like get sucked into that black hole and you're like,
On Amazon, 1-star review because your book was 3 days late or they didn't like the price. Yes. Right. So how do you feel about I'm trying to repeat it for the camera. How do you feel about reading reviews? And does it depress you or elate you?
So when my book was an advanced reader copy, I was really curious. I really wanted to know what people thought. So I read all of my Goodreads reviews, and then I became utterly depressed for a long time. And then I learned something about myself, and maybe this is all authors universally, but the amount of praise and love that I want to get from my book is like unlikely, and like the positive reviews don't really stick, and the negative ones really, really stick. So I stopped reading my reviews because I was getting much more of a negative vibe, even though they were more positive or balanced. What I was remembering were those like zingers, and that was sticking. So I've stopped reading them.
some people when they review, like when you give negative reviews, people like tend to pay more attention, and I feel like some reviewers just get so many negative reviews, which I don't feel are in line with the book.
Yeah, I admire your restraint. I'm a sucker. And it's kind of like doing performance appraisals, where you get a performance appraisal at work, and you just the boss will say, "Oh, this was wonderful," but you might want to work on this. It's like, oh my God, I have to work on that. So I have the same issue with it. There's Rena, the character in my book, has this thing about only feeding her child gluten-free products. Gluten-free. I had a review on Goodreads, and the woman was so upset with me. She said, because I was saying, somebody writes to Rena's blog and says, "You're an idiot. Gluten. People need gluten in the diet." And I apologize to anybody here with gluten allergy, but she wrote and she said, I can't believe you did that. You know, gluten is poison to the body, and it's it's a character. So I'm trying to be level about it, and this what happens when you're at debut or any new book that comes out. The things come in, and you're sort of as happy as you remember that saying, you're only as happy as your least happy child. Okay, you're only as happy as your recent review, and so it's like. And I just feel like saying that is having somebody say, okay, what's the norm? How am I doing? I don't know if you're feeling that way, but I'm like,
yeah, and that's why I started reading them, because I wanted that. And then I just remembered, like, oh yeah, like when I read, I don't like some of the book, you know, like
Right.
you start to get a little balance and you realize your favorite authors have 1-star reviews and you're like, oh
Exactly.
yeah, it's totally subjective.
Nobody,
This
not
is not
everybody's
like,
gonna love it.
this
Yeah.
is not my official like review like that's being delivered to me.
You're great.
So as a
You're like-
reviewer, I have a question for you. Do you read the book in the light of what the author intended the book to be, or in the light of what you want the book to be?
So I
I'm not
have,
trying to put you on
No,
the
you're
spot,
fine.
but I think
So-
Come on, Tiffany.
I have a special needs child, so for me, I wanted to connect with Raina, but obviously I could not.
Mhm.
So for me, I try to envision what the author's thinking, but then I also kind of take it in my, like, I envision, even though you stop at some point what would go on in the future, and then I hope for like a second book, but which you said you're not doing, like that's,
Oh, the continuation of this book?
Yeah.
No.
so,
Sorry.
I don't know. I also, when I review, like you said, there's not going to be you like everything about the whole book. There will always be something that you may not like about the book, but I at least always try to find 3 positives in every book, regardless of what I thought about the book.
The reason I asked you that is that is a critical question for an editor. When you are editing someone else's book, are you editing the book they want to write, or are you editing the book you want them to write, or which you think will make it more saleable? And it's a serious ethical question. It's very hard to get inside someone else's creative process and not, warp it in a direction that you might want to go. I have over the years learned to do it, but it's very hard. Every once in a while, I slip.
Uh-oh.
Any of you
Tiffany too
any of
sees
you
it.
read John Talton, an author that we published? Okay, well, so John wrote a book in which he can be very down about changes in Phoenix from when he was young. This is the worst thing I ever did to an author. It's just so awful. Anyway, he wrote this really great book, and then at the end, he couldn't resist doing his, Phoenix is falling apart, how awful it was. It was way better in the old days and all. And by chance, this whole section fell on a separate and final page in the ARC, in the advanced reading copy when it was prepared. So I gave it some serious thought, and then I ripped out the last page of every one. And I wrote to John, and I said, we didn't have time to discuss it. I said, but I didn't think your book should end on this really down note. And all the reviews said, amazing. This book was upbeat, but I shouldn't have done it because it was his book, It wasn't for me to rip out the page. So.
No, but then your editor has the responsibility for doing something that they believe is going to sell. Mm-hmm. And so if the editor says, I don't think this is going to be saleable, what's...
Well, it's had a positive effect because in his subsequent writing, he didn't stray
He
into
learned from it.
Either he thought I'd do it again, or maybe, or he thought he would have a more positive. For those who are interested in books about Phoenix, he's written a whole series set here, and they're absolutely wonderful. So, have you read John?
No, but
Now you're going to, right?
I'm in a lot of groups of reviewers, and one thing that a lot of people agree on is they tend to rate depressive books lower because when they get done reading, they just kind of feel down, and that's not typically the type of feeling they would like to have after a book.
You don't want to step back at the end into the gloom. You want it to end, and that's it. Anybody else have a question? Oh, sorry, way back there.
Way back here. Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Mary.
I am enthralled by your character of Claire. She has a depth of character that, as the book unfolds, is really interesting. Did you picture her as the book portrays her, or is she even deeper in your own imagination of her depth of character? I mean, you get to know these people so intimately.
Yeah.
And did you do that early on? Did you get to know her character early on, or did she really develop her character as the book unfolded?
Claire came, both of the characters, maybe Kelsey has the same experience, they came to me fully formed. I knew what she looked like. I mean, that's, if you'll see the cover, is the red hair and the green eye. I knew that she was that. I knew she was tall and slim. So I was very familiar with her. I do not do what a lot of authors do. A lot of authors will take sheets of paper and they'll write out the person's history. And they'll write out, their favorite colors and what they eat for breakfast. I don't, because to me, I just want to get in there and I want to write them. I knew she had to grow, but it's like any of us who have to grow. You have to be somewhere first, and then you're going to transition to different things depending on what happens in your life. So that's a great question about whether I foresaw the changes she would make. I needed to get her where I needed to get her at the end, which means she had to change. So I had to figure. I mean, there's a lot of creativity to it, but there's a lot of strategy. So I had to figure out what circumstances she was going to be in. And in order to do that, I had to change her I had to have her recognize things in herself, and that's what happened as she went along. But she kind of came fully formed. She was easier to write because she's also graduates with an English degree. I think she was more aligned to my character than Rena. Rena's a little rough-hewn, and that was, talking about the editing process. We had a lot of talking back and forth. You need to make Rena tougher. You need to make Rena tougher. So I'll tell you a brief story. Rena, for those of you who read the book, has quite the potty mouth. Drops a lot of expletives. And when they said you have to make Rena truffler, I thought, well, all right. So I put more expletives into. And then my agent wrote back and said, there's a little too much of that. So, speaking of going through, so I went through and you can do control find in your computer and you can pick up those words. And so every third one I came to, I said, well, is this gratuitous? Maybe this doesn't work. And I would either take it out or leave it in. And so that's how we removed some of them. And we finally got Rena to a place where she's curses just enough.
For me, a lot of my supporting characters were there from the start. The Martin family sort of personalities and their conflicts with each other, especially, I sort of knew. And it was my main character who gave me a lot of trouble. In the first couple ones, I think I was so in love with Raymond Chandler and Marlowe that I really wanted her to be this dry, sort of snide narrator, and to
This is
Finn,
yeah.
the nanny, and to really sort of see this Martin family almost sort of negatively and be very judgmental of them. But that wasn't working because then she didn't have any stakes in what happened to them. She was sort of unscathed by the outcome. So then I had to sort of go back and think, okay, she needs to have a stronger connection here. And so then that's where she sort of gained a whole new past, and she becomes really attached to the family in this one. And then that's her starting point. So that was a pretty big, I thought, for me to have to change your main character is a very frustrating thing to have to do. But it was worth it because she just grew into that person.
Big difference.
It would make more sense to have a biography, a Bible started for your character if you were planning a series, because then you'd have it to refer to.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But if your story is going to be complete in and of itself, then you don't really need to, nub down the color of her eyes or where she went or whatever, because it's not going to come up again.
Mm-hmm.
Series writers get trapped sometimes, because but fortunately in this day and age they have fans who can't remind them. And some of them actually ask fans. Some of particularly science fiction writers, right? Patrick's our science fiction guy. Some of them actually ask their fans, I can't remember, or what color were so and so's eyes, or or where was he born, or was he married before or something. The fans always know, even if the author can't remember. It's extremely helpful. So I want to thank you all for your attention. Just because a lot of you are new, what we have learned over the years is that these chairs are only friendly to your butt for about 60 minutes, plus a little time leading into it. But also because you've taken the trouble to come down here, and many of you have driven some distance, we always try to give you at least an hour so that the experience is worth it. And that's one reason that we do interviews and wherever we talk about a lot of other stuff, because the truth is you can only talk about the book for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. After that you're going to ruin the plot, so we have to do other stuff, and sometimes we digress off into various things. So if that annoys you, the reason is so that we can end up in our 30-minute, 60-minute slot and everybody had a good time. At least I hope you did. So I'm going to wave goodbye to our Facebook audience, and